1. A defiant photographer. The men's 1,500-meter freestyle swimming event was nearing its climax, the tension in the air thick with excitement. But amidst the cheers and splashes, a different kind of struggle was unfolding. A woman in a red hat, her hands trembling with a mix of frustration and determination, had tried again and again to capture a close-up shot of Adolf Hitler. Each time, the black guards had pushed her back, their faces cold and unyielding. But at the last moment, as if propelled by sheer defiance, she broke through the cordon. The camera shook in her hands as she raised it. This was her chance, her moment. 2. The despair of a nation. As the Red Army and Western allies closed in on Berlin, fear spread like wildfire. It was not just the sound of distant artillery or the sight of burning buildings. It was a silence in homes where entire families chose death over surrender. The streets of Germany bore witness to a tragedy unseen before. 3,881 lives lost to their own hands, a grim testament to a people who felt they had no future. In dimly lit rooms, parents held their children close, whispering final words of love before drinking poison. Others, overwhelmed by despair, stepped off bridges or pulled triggers, their faces frozen in terror and sorrow. 3. A man who refused to salute. It was 1936, a grand ceremony filled with patriotic fervor, the air heavy with the weight of expectation. Hundreds of men and women stood with their arms raised in salute, their faces masked with forced loyalty or genuine devotion. But in the sea of rigid salutes, one man stood firm, arms defiantly crossed. His heart pounded, his palms damp with sweat. He knew the risk. Disobedience in Nazi Germany was not a small thing. And yet he stood there, refusing to bow, refusing to become part of the machine. Was it courage? Was it anger? Or was it the sheer will of a man who refused to betray his soul? 4. A cold stare in a war zone. August 15, 1941. The air in the Shirokaya Street concentration camp in Minsk was thick with the stench of suffering. Heinrich Himmler walked through the camp, his gaze impassive, his very presence a harbinger of death. But as he passed a young Soviet prisoner of war, something rare happened. The prisoner, a boy barely out of his teens, did not cower. He did not lower his eyes. Instead, he stared directly at Himmler, unflinching, his face a mix of defiance and resignation. A silent battle waged in that single gaze, one of power versus resistance, of life versus death. 5. The firestorm of Dresden. In February 1945, the city of Dresden burned. The flames rose high into the sky, consuming everything in their path. Thousands of civilians, mothers clutching infants, elderly couples who had lived their whole lives in these streets, were swallowed by the firestorm. The screams were lost in the howling wind and the roar of collapsing buildings. Survivors stumbled through the wreckage, their skin burned, their eyes hollow with grief. Some cursed the heavens. Others simply fell to their knees, whispering prayers to a God they weren't sure was listening. 6. Hitler's vanity. Adolf Hitler stood before the camera, his hands gesturing, his face contorted into expressions of mock rage, defiance, and determination. The photographs were meant for practice, to perfect his public image. But behind those exaggerated expressions, behind the carefully rehearsed anger, was something more unsettling. A man obsessed with his own reflection. His fingers gripped the playback device, listening to his voice with a critical ear. Was he convincing enough? Was he powerful enough? In that dimly lit room, it was not just a man rehearsing. It was a man molding himself into a symbol of destruction. 7. A boy soldier's breakdown. Hans-Georg Heinke was just 16. His hands shook as the American soldiers closed in, his rifle lying uselessly at his feet. Tears streamed down his dirt-covered face, his chest heaving with sobs. The war had taken everything, his father, his mother, his childhood. Just days ago, he had stood tall, believing in victory, believing in the words drilled into him by propaganda. Now, reality crashed down on him like an avalanche. He was not a soldier. He was just a scared, broken boy, lost in a war he had never truly understood. 8. The evolution of criminal photography. In the late 19th century, criminals ceased to be faceless. Paris police official Alphonse Bertillon ensured that, one by one, men and women stood before his camera, their faces captured with mechanical precision. Some glared at the lens, their eyes filled with defiance. Others shrank before it, ashamed and weary. The photographs told stories of poverty, of desperation, of cruelty. With every click of the shutter, Bertillon documented not just criminals, but human souls at their lowest, their most vulnerable. 9. The Montparnasse train disaster. October 22, 1895. The train hurtled toward the Montparnasse station, its driver pushing the limits to make up lost time. The brakes failed. In the chaos of screeching metal and panicked screams, the massive locomotive burst through the station's facade, its iron body teetering dangerously over the edge. Bystanders watched in horror, their hands covering their mouths, their eyes wide with disbelief. In the wreckage, injured passengers moaned for help, their faces streaked with blood and soot. Time seemed to freeze in that moment. A single miscalculation, and history was made. 10. The last duels. You would think dueling belonged to the past. Yet, well into the 20th century, men still face each other with swords, their eyes locked in deadly determination. It was not just about honor. It was about pride, about proving one's worth in a world that had long since abandoned such rituals. The clashing of steel, the gasps of spectators, the sting of a blade cutting flesh. These were echoes of an era refusing to die. 11. The Weeping Frenchmen. The streets of Marseille were filled with the rhythmic march of soldiers. The tricolor flags of fallen France carried solemnly toward Africa. The city watched in silence, but among the crowd, one man could not hold back his grief. Tears streamed down his weathered face, his lips quivering with sorrow too deep for words. He had seen his country fall, had felt the weight of defeat settle on his chest like a stone. In that single moment, in that single tear-streaked face, the heartbreak of a nation was captured forever.